Naris Calethorn had spent 19 years in the Correlate Assembly's Historical Records Division, without ever once finding a file that made her hands go still over the console. But the one she opened on an unremarkable morning in the archive's lower vault did exactly that, and she sat with it for the better part of an hour before she understood why it frightened her as much as it did. It was not the age of the file that troubled her, though it was old, older than most of the records she handled in a division whose entire purpose was cataloging the slow accumulation of the Assembly's 4-century history. It was not the classification, though the file bore a restriction tag she had never personally encountered before, one that required a records officer of her seniority simply to view its contents. What troubled her was the small, unremarkable timestamp at the bottom of the transmission log, and the still smaller, more unremarkable notation beside it, written in the clipped procedural language of an administrator who had clearly never expected anyone to read it again. Signal received. Species unverified, contact threshold not met. Recommend observation protocol only. No intervention authorized. Beneath that notation, in the same clipped hand, a second line, added some hours later according to the log's internal timestamp. Signal terminated. No further transmissions received from source. She read those 2 lines perhaps a dozen times before she opened the attached audio file, and when she did, the voice that filled the small archive alcove was not correlate at all. It was human, young, a woman's voice strained thin by something that had clearly cost her everything she had left to give it, speaking in a language the file's automatic translation matrix rendered, imperfectly but unmistakably, into words that Naris Calethorn would carry with her for the rest of her career. This is the colony transport Horizon's Reach, 41 days out from our last confirmed position, hull integrity failing across 6 decks, life support critical. We have 812 souls aboard, including 200 children. We are transmitting on every frequency our systems can reach. If anyone receives this, we are not asking for rescue. We are asking for anyone, anywhere, to simply tell us we are not alone out here. Please, someone, anyone, please answer. The signal continued for 19 more hours, according to the log growing steadily weaker, steadily more desperate, before it terminated entirely. And Naris Calethorn sat in the small archive alcove with her hands finally, genuinely still, and understood that she had just found something the Correlate Assembly's own official history had never once mentioned in 4 centuries of careful, comprehensive record-keeping. The distress call had reached a correlate sensor buoy on the outer edge of the Threll expanse 43 years earlier, relayed automatically through the modest administrative network that monitored the boundary between confirmed correlate territory and the wide, sparsely surveyed regions beyond it. Regions that had not yet, at the time, produced a single confirmed contact with any species advanced enough to be classified for formal diplomatic engagement. The Contact Threshold Office, the small administrative division responsible for evaluating exactly this kind of ambiguous signal, had received it within hours, logged it, and assigned it for review to a mid-level registrar named Velko Osserin, a careful, unremarkable bureaucrat 2 years from retirement who had, in the 11 years preceding that morning, never once authorized an intervention beyond the strict boundaries of established protocol, and who had, by every account Naris could later find in his personnel file, considered that record a point of genuine professional pride. Osserin had reviewed the signal according to the procedures he had followed his entire career. The species transmitting it did not appear in any correlate database. Its technology, based on the modest signal strength and the crude translation matrix required to render its language into anything comprehensible, suggested a civilization well below the threshold, the Assembly's non-interference doctrine required for formal contact. The doctrine itself, drafted nearly 2 centuries earlier by administrators who had never anticipated the specific, agonizing weight of the decision it would eventually place on a man like Velko Ossarin, existed for reasons that had once seemed entirely reasonable. To prevent the correlate assembly's overwhelming technological advantage from disrupting the natural development of younger species, to avoid the kind of paternalistic intervention that had, in the assembly's own distant history, produced generations of dependent, resentful client worlds rather than genuine partners. Ossarin had read that doctrine 1,000 times across his career. He had believed in its wisdom the way a man believes in tea. He walls of a house he has lived in his entire life, without ever once testing whether they would hold under whether they were not built to withstand. He had signed the recommendation for observation-only protocol at 3:47 hours, correlate standard time, and he had gone home that evening, and he had eaten his evening meal, and he had gone to sleep. And the following morning he had returned to his desk and reviewed 41 other signals of similarly ambiguous classification, none of which, according to the log Naris now held, he had ever thought about again in any way his surviving records reflected. For the remaining 2 years of his career, the horizon's reach had been 41 days out from Earth's third wave of colonial expansion when the micrometeor storm found it. A slow, aging generation vessel carrying 812 colonists toward a system its own surveys had flagged as promising, traveling well beyond the range of any established human relay network, in the particular dangerous silence of a species still decades away from understanding how much of the galaxy around it was already occupied. The storm itself was unremarkable by any measure that mattered beyond the ship it struck, a scattered debris field left over from some ancient stellar collision, the kind of hazard that had claimed vessels before and would claim vessels again, indifferent to the particular tragedy of timing that placed the horizon's reach directly in its path. The damage was catastrophic almost immediately. Captain Elias Marchetti, a career naval officer who had commanded the vessel since its launch 11 years earlier, spent the first 6 hours of the crisis doing everything his training had prepared him to do, sealing breached decks, redirecting power to failing life support, coordinating a damage control effort that would, in the years that followed, become the subject of extensive study within the reformed human colonial administration, precisely because of how much of the ship's eventual survival depended on decisions made in those first desperate hours. It was his chief engineer, a woman named Dr. Sofia Alvarenga, who first suggested transmitting a distress signal on every frequency the ship's failing communications array could still reach, not because either of them believed rescue was realistic this far from any confirmed human presence, but because, as Alvarenga put it to Marchetti in a conversation the ship's own recovered logs would later preserve, sometimes the only thing left to do with hope was spend it anyway, on the smallest possible chance that it might land somewhere that mattered. It landed, as it happened, on a correlate sensor buoy, and a registrar named Velko Ossarin, and a decision made according to a doctrine that had never once considered what it might feel like to be on the receiving end of its careful, principled restraint. The 19 hours the signal continued transmitting were, according to the recovered logs Naris, would spend the following weeks piecing together with a thoroughness that eventually consumed every other assignment on her desk. The hours in which the horizon's reaches, crew, and colonists made the decisions that would determine which of them lived and which of them did not. There was no rescue coming, And by the 14th hour, Marchetti understood this with the particular, exhausted clarity of a commander who had run out of better options. And he made the decision that would define the rest of his life, and the lives of everyone who survived what followed. To abandon the ship's failing core sections entirely, consolidating every remaining colonist into the vessel's three most structurally sound compartments, and to attempt, with what remained of the ship's damaged engines, a desperate course correction toward a moon in a nearby system that the ship's surveys had flagged months earlier as marginally habitable, a backup contingency no one had ever expected to need in earnest. Captain Elias Marchetti found Dr. Sofia Alvarenga in the ship's failing engineering bay 6 hours into the crisis. Her hands blackened with soot from a coolant fire she had personally extinguished 20 minutes earlier. Her voice hoarse from shouting instructions over the groan of a hull that had not been designed to survive the kind of stress now being placed on it. "Give me the honest number, Sophia," he said. "Not the number you'd give the colonists if I asked you to brief them, the one you'd give me." She looked at him for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice carried none of the practiced calm she had maintained for the crew gathered around her station. "If we hold current course, we lose the ship entirely within 30 hours, Elias, all 812 of us. If we consolidate into the forward sections and make the course correction toward the moon my survey flagged 8 months ago, we have a chance. I won't lie to you and call it a good chance, but it's tea. He only chance the mathematics currently offer, and I'd rather spend what's left of our fuel trying to reach it than spend it holding a course that guarantees the ending either way." "And the distress signal?" "Still transmitting," she said. "I don't expect an answer, Elias. I want to be honest about that, too. We're 41 days out from anything resembling a confirmed human relay, and if there's anyone else out here who could hear us, we have no way of knowing whether they'd even understand what they were hearing, let alone whether they'd care enough to respond. But I'd rather my son grow up, if he grows up, knowing his mother spent her last resources insisting someone answer, than knowing she went quiet and accepted the silence without a fight. Call it stubbornness. Call it whatever you'd like. I'm not turning that transmitter off until the power itself runs out." Marchetti nodded slowly and gave the order for the evacuation to begin. And in the 11 days that followed, he would watch Sofia Alvarenga make the calculation that would define the rest of both their lives. Placing her own son among the children assigned to the compartment her own survey data marked as marginally safer than the one she herself would occupy for the remainder of the desperate, grinding journey toward a moon that offered no guarantee of survival beyond the simple, exhausted fact that it was somewhere to go. He did not learn until the final hours of the journey that her calculation, careful and precise as every other decision she made across those 11 days, had been wrong by the narrowest possible margin, a margin measured in the position of a single support strut that failed. In the compartment she had judged safer, at the worst possible moment, and he stood beside her in the ship's makeshift medical bay as she held her son for the last several minutes available to either of them, and he understood. Watching her, that whatever settlement they eventually built on whatever ground they eventually reached would carry this particular grief in its foundation, for as long as anyone who remembered it remained alive to pass the memory forward. The moon they eventually reached was cold, thin-aired, and unforgiving in ways the ship's original surveys had only partially anticipated. And the 606 colonists who survived the journey spent the following decade building, from the wreckage of a ship never designed to be permanently grounded, a settlement that would eventually become known, across the slowly expanding network of human colonial worlds, as Hollow Landing, a name chosen deliberately. According to the settlement's own founding charter, to ensure that no one who lived there and no one who came after would ever forget the particular, hollow silence of a distress call that went 18 hours unanswered before the survivors finally understood, with a certainty that shaped everything about the community they went on to build, that they had been entirely, completely alone. The first winter nearly finished what the meteor storm had started. The moon's thin atmosphere, marginally breathable according to the ship's original survey, but never intended to support permanent habitation without considerable engineering, forced the surviving colonists into a punishing routine of constant maintenance on the salvaged life support systems that kept their improvised shelters livable. And Marchetti, who had assumed command of the settlement by unspoken consensus rather than any formal vote, spent those first months learning an entirely different kind of leadership than the one his naval career had prepared him for, not the leadership of decisive action in a single crisis, but the slower, more exhausting leadership of holding a community together through months of grinding, unglamorous survival, where the enemy was not a single dramatic threat, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 small failures that could, individually, be managed, and collectively, if allowed to compound, could finish the settlement as thoroughly as the original disaster nearly had. It was in those first hard months that the settlement's particular character began to take shape, a character that would, in time, become the subject of extensive study by human sociologists trying to understand exactly what made Hollow Landing's descendants so distinctly, stubbornly self-reliant compared to colonies founded under considerably gentler circumstances. Every child born in the settlement's first generation grew up hearing the story of the 18 unanswered hours not as a distant historical footnote, but as a living, present fact of their community's identity, repeated at the settlement's annual founding commemoration with a specific ritual solemnity that Alina Alvarenga Cho, born a generation after the original crossing, would later describe as the closest thing her community had to a shared religious observance. The lesson embedded in that ritual was never bittern. Exactly, though grief remained close beneath its surface, for as long as anyone who had lived through the original crossing survived to attend. The lesson was self-sufficiency, deliberate and complete, a settlement-wide commitment to never again finding itself in a position where its survival depended entirely on the goodwill of someone else's attention. Nerys Calethorn brought her findings to her division's supervisor 11 days after she first opened the file, and her supervisor, a careful, cautious woman named Director Ussa Corinth, who had spent her own long career carefully avoiding exactly the kind of controversy Nerys was now placing on her desk, read the recovered logs twice before she spoke. "You understand," Corinth said finally, "what this file will mean if it becomes part of the formal historical record before the ratification talks with Earth conclude." "I understand what it will mean if it doesn't, and someone on the human delegation finds it independently," Nerys said. "We are 3 weeks from finalizing the most significant treaty this assembly has negotiated in a generation, Director. I do not believe we can afford to have that treaty built on a foundation we know to be incomplete, whatever the political cost of completing it honestly." Corinth was quiet for a long moment, her attention moving across the recovered audio file's waveform still displayed on the console between them, the particular visual shape of a young woman's voice pleading into a silence that had, in the end, answered her with nothing at all. "I will bring this to the council," she said finally. "I want you to understand, Nerys, that I do not know how they will receive it, and I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the political calculation may favor burying this rather than confronting it, whatever either of us believes the right course to be. The council received it, in the end, with considerably more gravity than either of them had anticipated, in large part because of a single member whose presence at that particular session would prove, in retrospect, decisive in ways no one, including the member herself, fully anticipated in advance. High Curator Thessaly Vorn had held her position for only 3 years, young for the office by correlate standards, elevated in the aftermath of a broader generational reform movement that had, in the decade preceding her appointment, begun quietly questioning some of the older doctrines the Assembly's administration had long treated as beyond serious debate. She listened to the recovered audio file in full silence, the entire council chamber holding the particular stillness of a room confronting something it had not expected to confront. And when it finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "I would like every member of this council to understand exactly what we are discussing," she said. "We are not discussing an administrative error, though the language of the original file will tempt some of you to describe it that way, because that language is more comfortable than the alternative. We are discussing 812 people who trusted that a distress signal, transmitted honestly and desperately into the dark, might reach someone capable of answering it. 206 of them did not survive because no one did. I do not believe Administrator Osserin was a cruel man. I have read his full record, and I believe, as much as it is possible to believe anything about a decision made 43 years ago by someone I never met, that he followed the doctrine exactly as it was written, exactly as generations of administrators before him had followed it, without malice, without indifference beyond the ordinary, exhausted indifference of a man reviewing his 40-second signal of the day. That is precisely what troubles me most about this file, honored colleagues. Not that one man made one catastrophic decision, that an entire doctrine built with genuinely good intentions made that decision inevitable, and would make it again today, if the same signal arrived on the same desk under the same protocol we have not yet found the will to revise. The Council's deliberation over what followed occupied the better part of 2 weeks, and it was not, Neris would later reflect, the unanimous moral reckoning that the eventual outcome sometimes made it appear to have been in retrospect. Councillor Brenthais Ole, the Assembly's longest-serving representative from its oldest founding cluster, argued forcefully and at length against any formal disclosure, in terms that Neris found herself thinking about uneasily for years afterward. "I do not dispute the tragedy of what this file describes," Ole said, in a session Neris was permitted to observe from the records gallery. "I dispute the wisdom of unraveling 4 centuries of careful non-interference doctrine because one administrator, working within the honest limits of the information available to him, at the time made a defensible decision that happened, through no particular fault of his own judgment, to produce a terrible outcome. We did not know, in that moment, what we know now. We did not know the humans would become the partner they have since proven themselves to be. Doctrine cannot be built on hindsight, honored colleagues, however painful that hindsight eventually reveals itself to be. If we revise our entire framework for contact with unverified species every time an ambiguous decision produces an outcome we later regret, we will find ourselves with no doctrine at all, only a shifting, reactive set of exceptions carved out after every tragedy, which is itself its own kind of failure. High Curator Vorn had listened to that argument without interrupting, and when she answered it, her voice carried none of the easy dismissal Neris had half expected from a leader whose own instincts on the matter were already, by then, clearly formed. "You are not wrong. "Counselor, that hindsight is a dangerous foundation for policy," she said. "But I would ask you to consider what the doctrine actually asked Administrator Osserin to weigh in that moment before he made his decision. It did not ask him to weigh the likelihood that this particular species would someday become a valuable partner. It asked him to weigh nothing beyond a signal's technological classification against the abstract principle of non-interference, with no mechanism whatsoever for considering the plain, urgent fact of 812 lives in immediate danger. That is not a defensible decision made with incomplete information, Counselor. That is a doctrine that never once asked the question that mattered most, because the question that mattered most was never written into its framework to begin with. I am not proposing we revise our doctrine because of one regrettable outcome. I am proposing we revise it because this file has shown us, with a clarity I do not believe any of us can honestly claim to have possessed before today, that our framework was built to protect a principle at the direct expense of the very lives it should have existed to consider first. The vote that followed when it finally came was not unanimous. Ole and 4 other counselors abstained rather than formally support the disclosure, a fact the Assembly's public record would preserve without editorial comment. But it carried, and Director Corrent's warning to Nerys in the weeks that followed proved, in the end, only partially accurate. The political cost of disclosure was real and considerable, but it did not bury the reform the way Corrent had privately feared it might, in large part because the Council's own deliberation had already begun to unfold alongside, and increasingly entangle itself with, the formal ratification talks already underway with the human delegation, talks that Ambassador Grace Adami had traveled 6 weeks across contested space to conduct, carrying with her a mandate from Earth's unified government to secure exactly the kind of durable, mutually respectful partnership that the previous decade of cautious, incremental contact between the two powers had been slowly, carefully building toward. She learned of the Horizon's Reach file not through any formal correlate disclosure, but through a private, unofficial channel that Nerys Calethorn arranged herself, in a decision that would cost her a formal reprimand from Director Corrent and, eventually, a transfer to a considerably less prestigious division, a cost Nerys would tell colleagues, years later, she had never once regretted paying. I want you to understand why I'm telling you this before your government hears it through official channels, Nerys said, meeting Adami in a quiet reception room adjacent to the formal negotiating chamber, her voice low enough that the small handful of aides accompanying the ambassador had to lean in slightly to follow the translation. The Council is debating, right now, how much of this to disclose and how to frame it if they do. I do not trust that debate to produce the honest disclosure your government deserves, whatever the eventual outcome. I would rather you hear the truth from someone who found it than a carefully managed version of it from someone deciding how much truth your treaty can survive. Adami listened to the recovered audio file in the same silence Thessaly Vorn's council chamber had held weeks earlier, and when it finished, her expression carried none of the visible fury Nerys had privately braced herself for. Something quieter instead, something that troubled Nerys more precisely because she could not immediately name it. Hollow Landing, Adami said finally. I know that colony, Ms. Calethorn. Everyone in Earth's colonial administration knows that colony. It's one of the oldest surviving settlements outside the home system, and it has a reputation within our own government for a particular kind of stubborn, earned self-sufficiency that most administrators find useful to study and considerably more difficult to actually replicate. I have read the founding charter. I did not know, until this moment the full circumstance of why it was written the way it was written. She was quiet for a moment, her attention on the small console still displaying the file's waveform. I need to bring this to my government before we proceed any further in these talks. I want to be honest with you about what that likely means, Ms. Calethorn, because I think you've earned honesty in return for the risk you just took. I do not know whether this ends the treaty entirely. I know that it will not be signed on the terms currently on the table, not once my government understands what your council's doctrine did, and continued to protect through 43 years of silence, to 812 people who deserved better than the observation-only recommendation a tired administrator gave them on his way home to dinner. The talks did not collapse, though for 11 difficult days it appeared, to nearly everyone involved that they might. Earth's government, upon receiving Adami's report, convened an emergency session that stretched across 3 full days of deliberation, a session complicated considerably by the presence, via secure transmission, of Hollow Landing's own colonial council, whose members, several of them children of the original 206 who had not survived the journey that founded their settlement, were given, at their own insistence, direct input into how Earth's broader government chose to respond. It was the settlement's senior administrator, a woman named Elena Alvarenga, granddaughter of the chief engineer who had lost her own son in those first desperate 11 days, who delivered the message that Adami would later describe, in her own private accounts of the crisis, as the single most consequential intervention of the entire negotiation. "I have spent my whole life," Alvarenga said, speaking to Earth's assembled government from the small, unglamorous council chamber of a settlement still visibly built from the bones of a ship that had never been designed to be permanently grounded. Hearing the story of those 18 hours from people who lived through them, and I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life deciding what I believe that story means, beyond the simple, terrible fact of it. I do not believe it means we should refuse partnership with the Correlate Assembly out of grief, however justified that grief remains. I believe it means we have an opportunity right now that my grandmother's generation never had to make certain the doctrine that killed 206 of our people is genuinely, permanently dismantled, rather than simply apologized for and quietly preserved underneath the apology. I would ask this government, respectfully, not to walk away from these talks. I would ask instead that we use the leverage this terrible discovery has handed us to demand something considerably more valuable than an apology. I would ask that we demand change, verified and durable, in exactly the doctrine that made my grandmother's loss possible, so that no other species ever again spends 18 hours transmitting into a silence that could have been answered, and wasn't, because a tired man on the other end of it decided the paperwork wasn't worth the trouble. Earth's government carried that message back to the negotiating table, and the 11 days that followed were, by Adami's own private account, the most difficult of her long diplomatic career. The Correlate delegation, led in those sessions by High Curator Vorn herself rather than the more junior negotiators who had conducted the earlier rounds of talks, arrived on the first day of the renewed proceedings with a formal statement of acknowledgement that Vorn read aloud in full, without abbreviation, before either side had exchanged a single word of procedural negotiation. "I want to state plainly, before this delegation raises a single term of the treaty we came here to discuss," Vorn said, "that the Correlate Assembly failed your people 43 years ago in a manner that no formal apology can adequately answer. We are not here today to negotiate around that failure, or to minimize it in service of a more favorable treaty. We are here to ask what genuine accountability would require of us, in your government's judgment, and we intend to meet that requirement in full, whatever the cost to terms we might otherwise have preferred. Adami, who had prepared for considerably more defensive posturing than this, found herself recalibrating her own approach in real time. "I appreciate the candor, High Curator," she said. "I want to be equally candid in return. My government does not want vengeance, and we are not interested in a treaty built on punishing your assembly for a decision made by an administrator none of us ever met. What we want is proof, structural and permanent, that the doctrine responsible for that decision has genuinely changed in a manner that outlasts this particular council, this particular High Curator, and this particular moment of political attention. Apologies fade. Ceremonies fade. We would like something considerably harder to walk back." The 11 days that followed were spent, in large part, on the granular, unglamorous work of drafting exactly that kind of durable structural change. A tiered response framework requiring mandatory life preservation review for any distress signal, regardless of the transmitting species classification status. An independent oversight body empowered to audit the contact threshold office's decisions on a rolling basis, and a formal, permanent memorial provision requiring the Assembly's official history to preserve the full, unabridged record of the horizon's reach, rather than the sanitized administrative footnote it had existed, as for the preceding 4 decades. Councillor Ohl's faction fought several of these provisions clause by clause, arguing that the oversight body in particular represented an unprecedented and dangerous erosion of the contact threshold office's institutional independence. And Vorn, more than once during those 11 days, found herself spending political capital she had not expected to need in order to hold her own council's support for terms her human counterparts considered, privately, to be the minimum acceptable floor, rather than any particularly generous concession. "I do not think your council understands what you are asking me to explain to my own government if these terms weaken further," Adami told Vorn in a private session on the 9th day, the negotiations having stalled for the better part of 2 days over the precise scope of the oversight body's authority. "Elena Alvarengacho is watching these proceedings, High Curator, along with a great many people at Hollow Landing who have spent their entire lives being told that their grandmother's death was the acceptable cost of a doctrine too important to abandon. If I return to my government with a treaty that leaves the substance of that doctrine intact behind a new layer of ceremonial language, I will not be bringing them proof. I will be bringing them a more polished version of the same silence." Vorn was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, something in her voice carried the particular exhaustion of a leader who had spent 9 days fighting a battle within her own government that her human counterpart could see only the surface of. "Give me until tomorrow, Ambassador," she said. "I intend to bring the full oversight provision back to my council one final time, and I intend to make clear, in terms I have thus far tried to avoid, exactly what I believe the cost of rejecting it will be, not to this treaty alone, but to the Assembly's own capacity to ever again claim, honestly, that it has learned anything from what its silence once cost." She kept that promise, and the final session of the Council's deliberation, conducted behind closed doors that Nerys Calethorn was not permitted to observe directly, but would later reconstruct from colleagues present in the chamber, produced the narrow but decisive majority that finally secured the oversight provision's passage largely intact. Councillor Ohl, whose opposition had shaped so much of the debate's earlier difficulty, cast one of the votes in favor, a decision that surprised nearly everyone present, including, by his own later account, Ohl himself. He sought out Neris some weeks afterward, in a meeting she had not requested and had not particularly expected, finding her at her modest workstation in the records division on an unremarkable afternoon, considerably quieter than the chaotic weeks that had preceded the treaty's final ratification. "I want to tell you something, Records Officer Calethorn," he said, "that I do not intend to say publicly because I do not believe public reconsideration serves anyone as well as private honesty does. I opposed this reform for reasons I still believe were not, in themselves, unreasonable. I believed then, and in some respects still believe now, that doctrine built hastily in the aftermath of tragedy risks becoming doctrine built on guilt rather than wisdom, and that the two do not always produce the same result." "What changed your vote?" Neris asked. "I read Administrator Ossarin's letters," Ole said. "The ones you recovered from the archive on his retirement world. I had convinced myself across the weeks of this debate that I was defending a principle, the independence of the contact threshold office, the danger of reactive policy making. I still believe that principle has some merit in the abstract. But I could not, after reading his own private uncertainty, continue to argue that the doctrine he followed was simply misapplied by an otherwise sound framework. He followed. Edit exactly as written, Records Officer, and it still produced a result his own conscience recognized as wrong before any of the rest of us were willing to say so aloud. I have sat on this council for 31 years defending doctrines I inherited rather than doctrines I would have designed myself if given the chance to begin again. I do not know that I am capable of the kind of full reckoning High Curator Vorn has undertaken. But I found, in the end, that I was no longer capable of casting a vote against the one change that might have spared him decades of private, unresolved doubt, whatever else it costs the institution I have spent my career defending. Neris thought about that conversation often in the years that followed, understanding it, eventually, as its own small but genuine piece of the larger reckoning the Assembly had undertaken. Not every conversion arriving through the same dramatic clarity that had moved Vorn or Adami or Alina Alvarengacho, but arriving instead, for a man like Ole, through the slower, more private work of confronting a single dead administrator's unfinished conscience and finding, in it, something he could no longer honestly argue against. The treaty was formally ratified 6 days later, and High Curator Vorn signed the reformed doctrine into permanent law on the same day the broader agreement was finalized, in a ceremony that Alina Alvarengacho attended in person, traveling 6 weeks across the same contested space her grandmother's ship had once drifted through, dying, unanswered, 4 decades earlier. "I want to tell you something before I sign this," Vorn said to her, in the quiet moments before the formal ceremony began, "that I do not believe will appear in any official record of today's proceedings, and that I would like you to carry with you regardless. I have read every word of Administrator Ossarin's original file, and I have read every word of your grandmother's recovered logs from those 11 terrible days, and I do not believe there is any version of an apology adequate to the distance between them. I am not signing this reform today because I believe it settles a debt. I am signing it because I believe it is the only honest response available to an institution that discovered, 43 years too late, that its careful, principled restraint had a cost it never once bothered to calculate in advance. And I would like your settlement, and your government, to understand that this assembly intends to spend considerably more than a single ceremony proving that the lesson has genuinely been learned." Alina Alvarengacho considered the High Curator for a long moment, and when she answered, Her voice carried the particular, hard-earned steadiness of a woman who had spent her entire life being shaped by a tragedy she had not personally witnessed, but had never once been permitted to forget. "My grandmother used to say," she said, "that the difference between an accident and a failure is whether the people responsible for it change anything afterward. I did not come here today for an apology, High Curator. I came here to see whether the change was real. I intend to keep watching for as long as I'm able to make certain it stays that way." The Reformed doctrine faced its first genuine test considerably sooner than either government anticipated, in a crisis that arrived, with the particular cruel timing history sometimes favors, less than 4 years after the treaty's ratification, when the Correlate Assembly's own home system found itself, without warning, in the path of a catastrophic stellar event that its own scientists had failed to predict in time to organize a coordinated, large-scale evacuation. A rogue gravitational anomaly, the remnant of a long-collapsed star system passing through correlate territory on a trajectory no prior survey had flagged as hazardous, began tearing at the outer edges of the Assembly's most populous home cluster, threatening, within a matter of months rather than years, the kind of large-scale destruction that would displace tens of millions of correlate citizens and permanently cripple the Assembly's core industrial and administrative infrastructure. High Curator Vorn, faced with a crisis her own government's resources were catastrophically underprepared to answer alone, found herself making, in the desperate early days of the emergency, the same kind of call that Velko Ossarin's desk had once received and quietly declined to answer. A formal request for emergency assistance, transmitted to every allied and treaty-bound power the Assembly could reach, including, for the first time in the young history of their partnership, a direct and urgent appeal to Earth. The Reformed doctrine faced its first genuine test considerably sooner than either government anticipated, in a crisis that arrived, with the particular cruel timing history sometimes favors, less than 4 years after the treaty's ratification, when the Correlate Assembly's own home system found itself, without warning, in the path of a catastrophic stellar event that its own scientists had failed to predict in time to organize a coordinated, large-scale evacuation. High Curator Vorn received the first preliminary readings from the Assembly's Deep Space Observatory network, at what her own staff would later describe as an unremarkable hour of an unremarkable morning. The kind of routine briefing she had sat through hundreds of times before without any particular sense that this one would prove different from the rest. The anomaly itself, the collapsed remnant of a star system torn apart some 100,000 years earlier, its gravitational wake still tearing through the surrounding dark long after the light of its original destruction had faded from any instrument capable of observing it directly, had drifted, undetected by any prior survey, into a trajectory that would carry it directly through the outer edge of the Assembly's most populous home cluster within a matter of months. "I want the numbers checked 3 more times before this leaves this room," Vorn told her science advisors, in the tense, disbelieving hour after the initial briefing concluded. "Because if these figures are correct, we are looking at the single largest evacuation this Assembly has ever attempted, conducted on a timeline that gives us perhaps a third of the preparation any responsible planning framework would consider adequate." The numbers held on the second check, and held again on the third, and Vorn spent the following 72 hours doing the same exhausting, unglamorous work that Captain Marchetti had once done aboard a dying human colony ship 4 decades earlier, triaging which sectors could be saved, which evacuation routes could realistically be secured in time, and which populations would have to wait in agonizing uncertainty. for resources that might not arrive before the anomaly's passage made rescue impossible. She found herself, more than once during those first desperate days, returning to a single memory that had lodged itself permanently in her thinking since the day she first heard the recovered audio of Sofia Alvarenga's distress call, the specific, terrible arithmetic of a commander forced to decide, in real time, whose survival could be guaranteed and whose could only be hoped for, and she understood with a clarity that shaped every subsequent decision of the crisis. That her assembly's own history had left her considerably better, prepared to make those decisions honestly than the administrators who had once faced a comparable choice and failed it. The formal appeal for Allied assistance went out on the third day of the crisis, transmitted simultaneously to every treaty-bound power within reach, and Nerys Calethorn, watching the response logs accumulate over the following hours from her position within the Records Division's Emergency Coordination Cell, found herself unable to fully separate her professional attention to the unfolding crisis from the private, anxious question she could not stop turning over. Would the answer that came back from Earth carry any trace, conscious or otherwise, of the debt the Assembly had never fully repaid? It did not, as it turned out, carry any trace of debt at all, a fact that troubled Nerys in a manner she had not anticipated until she understood, watching the human evacuation fleets approach vector update across the coordination display, exactly what its absence actually meant. Earth's response had not been calculated, hesitant, or conditional in any way that suggested a government weighing old grievances against present obligations. It had been immediate, generous, and delivered with a specific, practical urgency that read, to Nerys's careful eye, as the response of a government that had simply decided, as a settled matter requiring no fresh deliberation, exactly what kind of ally it intended to be. Earth's response arrived within 11 hours, considerably faster than the formal treaty's own emergency response provisions technically required, and it did not arrive in the form of a diplomatic transmission at all, but in the form of a fleet, modest by correlate standards, 31 vessels carrying emergency evacuation capacity, disaster response engineering teams, and in a detail that Vorn would describe years later. As the single moment she genuinely understood the full weight of what her government had rebuilt with humanity, a formal message from Elena Alvarenga Cho herself, transmitted from Hollow Landing, requesting and receiving personal authorization to travel aboard the lead evacuation vessel, so that she might, in her own words, be present for whatever came next. "I did not come here for symmetry, High Curator," she said, meeting Vorn in person for the second time in 4 years, standing now amid the chaotic, urgent work of an evacuation effort neither of their governments had ever expected to require. "I did not come here to prove a point about who answers distress signals and who doesn't. I came here because my grandmother spent 19 hours transmitting into a silence she believed, by the end of it, would never be answered. And I decided a long time ago that I did not want to live in a universe where that silence was simply passed forward, unchanged, to the next people desperate enough to need an answer. Whatever this assembly failed to give us 47 years ago, we are not interested in withholding from you today. That is not mercy, High Curator. It is simply the decision every one of us made, individually, a long time before this crisis ever arrived, about what kind of people we intended to be when someone else's distress call finally reached our own desk. Among the engineering teams Earth dispatched was a woman named Dr. Priya Ramanathan, a specialist in emergency structural stabilization who had, in the frantic organizational scramble of the crisis's opening days, been assigned to the evacuation of a correlate orbital habitat called Cassandra Station, home to just under 200,000 civilians, and dangerously exposed to the anomaly's earliest and most severe gravitational effects. She arrived aboard the lead evacuation vessel alongside Alina Alvarenga, and she spent the following 6 weeks working alongside correlate engineers she had never met before, in conditions considerably more dangerous than any disaster response deployment her career had previously required, coordinating the delicate, exhausting work of reinforcing failing structural supports long enough to allow a full evacuation before the station's own systems gave way entirely. "Why did you volunteer for this posting specifically?" a correlate engineer named Tessa Vorana asked her, during a rare pause in the 6th week of the effort, the two of them sharing a brief meal in the station's exhausted, half-evacuated central concourse. "Your government's contribution to this effort was already substantial before your own personal assignment. You did not need to be here on the most dangerous section of the entire evacuation." Ramanathan considered the question for a long moment before she answered. "I grew up in a family that talked about Hollow Landing a great deal growing up," she said. "Not because we had any personal connection to it. Because my grandmother used to say that every family in the outer colonies owed something to what that settlement's founders proved was possible, that people could be left entirely alone, with nothing but each other and whatever they could salvage, and still build something that lasted. I did not fully understand, until I read the history properly as an adult, exactly how that settlement came to be founded, or what it cost the people who founded it. When I heard about this crisis, and I heard that your government had reached out to mine specifically, I thought about the 18 hours Sofia Alvarenga spent transmitting into a silence nobody answered, and I decided I did not want to be the kind of engineer who let that particular silence happen twice, on my own watch, if there was anything at all I could do to prevent it. Vorana was quiet for a moment, her attention on the station's failing support struts visible through the concourse's cracked observation panel. "I did not know that history until this crisis began," she admitted. "I am ashamed to say that, but it is true. I have worked in correlate infrastructure engineering for 11 years, and I never once encountered the Horizons Reach file until the reforms that followed its disclosure changed the training protocols my own division uses. I think, Dr. Ramanathan, that I understand now why your government answered our call the way it did, in a manner that felt, to those of us receiving it, considerably more genuine than the treaty language alone would have led us to expect." "It's not complicated in the end," Ramanathan said. "We know what it costs to be the ones transmitting into silence. We decided a long time before this crisis that we would rather be remembered as the ones who answered." By the time Hollow Landing formally joined the broader network of human colonial administration, 3 decades after its founding, it had developed an engineering and agricultural expertise considerably beyond what its modest population would ordinarily have produced, a direct inheritance of the particular urgency that had shaped its first, desperate decade. And Alina Alvarenga, elected to lead the settlement's council in her own turn, carried into that office a version of her grandmother's stubbornness that had been refined, across 2 generations, into something considerably more deliberate and considerably more consequential than simple grief. The settlement's annual founding commemoration, held each year on the anniversary of the day the surviving colonists first set foot on the moon that became their permanent home, followed a ritual that had changed remarkably little across the generations since its first observance. Every resident of Hollow Landing, regardless of age or occupation, gathered in the settlement's central hall, itself constructed, in a detail the community had never once considered changing despite the availability of more comfortable materials, from salvaged plating recovered from the Horizon's Reach's original hull, and listened in full, unabridged silence to a recording of the original distress transmission, the same recording that would, decades later, sit undisturbed in a correlate archive vault until Nerys Calethorn's careful, unglamorous work brought it back into the light. Elena had attended that commemoration every year of her life, first as a child sitting beside grandparents who had lived through the crossing itself, then as an adult increasingly aware of how much responsibility for preserving the memory correctly would eventually fall to her own generation. And she had come, over the years, to understand the ceremony's central paradox in a way she found herself trying, with limited success. To explain to outsiders who occasionally asked why a community would choose to relive its own worst hour, deliberately, every single year, rather than allow the grief to soften with time the way grief ordinarily does. "We don't do it to keep the wound open," she told a visiting historian, some years before the correlate file's disclosure, in an interview that would later be quoted extensively in the Reformed Doctrine's public commentary. "We do it because the wound is not actually the point of the ceremony, whatever it looks like from outside. The point is the 18 hours themselves, not the silence that answered them, but the fact that my grandmother kept transmitting anyway, for the full 18 hours, believing less and less with every passing minute that anyone was listening, and choosing, regardless, not to stop. That's the part of our history I want every child in this settlement to carry with them, more than the grief, more than the anger at whoever failed to answer. The fact that even in a universe that gives you every reason to believe no one is listening, the right response is still to keep transmitting. That's not a lesson about the correlate assembly's failure. That's a lesson about what my grandmother's generation decided to become because of it, and I think it's the truest inheritance this settlement has ever had to offer anyone born into it. It was this same conviction, carried forward with a consistency that had shaped every major decision of her adult life, that led Elena Alvarenga-Cho to travel 6 weeks across contested space, not once but twice. First to witness the Reformed Doctrine's ratification, and later, during the evacuation crisis, to stand personally in the middle of the very kind of emergency her grandmother's ship had once faced entirely alone. Both journeys, she would say afterward in interviews that historians on both sides of the treaty would study for a generation, were, in her own understanding of them, the same journey continued, an unbroken thread running from a 9-year-old boy's death in a failing compartment to 198,000 correlate civilians safely evacuated from a station that would otherwise have claimed them. A thread her grandmother had begun spinning in the desperate, unanswered hours of a distress call, and that Elena had spent her entire life determined to see carried all the way through to something that finally, properly, resembled an answer. The evacuation of Cassandra Station concluded on the 41st day of the broader crisis, though not before a final, harrowing complication nearly cost the effort everything it had achieved. On the 38th day, with roughly 60,000 civilians still awaiting transport from the station's lower residential sectors, a secondary structural failure, triggered by stresses the anomaly's gravitational wake had placed on support systems already weakened by weeks of continuous strain, collapsed an entire connecting corridor between the station's main evacuation hub and the sectors still waiting to be cleared, severing the only remaining route capable of moving civilians to the waiting transport vessels in the numbers the timeline required. Ramanathan and Vorana spent the following 18 hours, alongside a joint team of correlate and human engineers working in conditions that both governments' own safety protocols would ordinarily have prohibited. Constructing an emergency bypass through a maintenance shaft never designed for the volume of foot traffic it would need to carry. A solution Vorana would later describe as the single most dangerous piece of improvised engineering of her entire career, and one that succeeded in the end. Only because the two teams had spent the preceding 5 weeks learning to trust each other's judgment in a manner neither government's formal training had specifically prepared them to develop. "I will tell you honestly," Vorana said to Ramanathan in the exhausted, adrenaline-thin hours after the last civilian finally cleared the bypass shaft, "that I did not believe this would hold when we began building it. I want you to know that I proceeded anyway, in part, because I had watched you work for 5 weeks by then, and I had decided I trusted your judgment considerably more than I trusted my own uncertainty." "That's the whole of it in the end," Ramanathan said, "trusting each other enough to build something neither of us would have attempted alone." Word of the corridor collapse and the improvised rescue that followed reached Captain Elias Marchetti on Hollow landing some weeks later, relayed through the same colonial news network that had, by then, begun carrying regular updates on the crisis unfolding in correlate space. And the old captain, well into his 80s by then, retired from any formal role in the settlement's governance, but still, by long habit, among the first residents to read each new dispatch as it arrived, found himself sitting with the report for a considerable while before he set it aside. He had outlived Sofia Alvarenga by decades, had buried most of his own generation of original crossing survivors in the settlement's modest cemetery over the years since, and had watched, with a satisfaction he rarely spoke of aloud, the granddaughter of his old chief engineer grow into a leader whose judgment he trusted as completely as he had once trusted her grandmother's. He thought, reading the account of the corridor collapse and the desperate, successful bypass that followed, of his own 11 days aboard a dying ship, of the particular, exhausted ingenuity that crisis sometimes demanded of people who had run out of every other option. And he thought that perhaps this was the truest inheritance Hollow Landing had ultimately passed forward into the wider galaxy. Not simply the memory of a silence once endured, but the specific, hard-won capability, forged in that same silence, to build something functional and life-saving out of whatever materials a desperate hour happened to leave available. He wrote a brief message to Alina that evening, the kind of unremarkable private correspondence that would never appear in any formal historical record, and he told her in it that he believed her grandmother would have been proud not of the treaty, nor the reform, nor even the 40 million lives the broader effort would go on to save, but of the specific, unglamorous 18 hours two engineers had spent building a bypass shaft together, trusting each other's judgment in the dark. Because that particular kind of trust, hard-earned and freely given, was the thing Sofia Alvarenga had spent her own last 11 days trying, against every discouragement the universe offered her, to believe might someday exist. Vorana and Ramanathan would go on to co-author a formal engineering paper on the collaborative techniques developed during those 6 weeks, a paper that would become required study material within both governments' emergency response training programs for a generation afterward. And Vorana would, in the acknowledgement section of that paper, include a line that several colleagues privately told her was unusual for a purely technical document, but that she insisted on preserving regardless. "This work exists because a species we once failed decided, without being asked twice, to answer us anyway." The broader evacuation effort concluded, in full, on the 239th day of the crisis, A coordinated, exhausting campaign across every affected sector of the home cluster that saved. By the most conservative estimates compiled afterward, upward of 40 million correlate citizens who would not have survived the anomaly's passage without the combined resources of every allied power that answered the Assembly's call. Earth's contribution, though modest in raw numbers compared to some of the Assembly's larger, longer-established allies, carried a weight within correlate public memory that no other contribution matched, in large part because of how thoroughly the story of Hollow Landing and the 18 unanswered hours that founded it had by then become woven into the broader correlate understanding of exactly what their partnership with Earth had cost both sides to build, and exactly what it had ultimately hard-earned. Come to mean, High Curator Vorn delivered a formal address to the Correlate Assembly's full council on the final day of the evacuation effort, standing before a chamber considerably more crowded than the one that had first heard the recovered logs of the Horizon's reach 4 years earlier. And she spoke, in the closing minutes of that address, about a single detail that had, in her own private accounting of the entire crisis, come to matter more than any casualty figure or resource tally the formal record would eventually preserve. She had asked Alina Alvarenga during the third week of the crisis, in a quiet moment stolen between coordination briefings, why she had chosen to remain aboard the lead evacuation vessel for the full duration of the effort, rather than returning to Hollow Landing, once the initial fleet deployment was secured. They had been standing together in the vessel's observation deck, watching the slow, methodical work of a rescue convoy loading civilians from a habitat whose structural integrity readings had turned steadily more alarming over the preceding days, and Alvarenga had been quiet for a long moment before she answered. "I keep thinking about the 18th hour," she said finally. "Not the first hour when my grandmother still believed someone might answer. The 18th, when the transmission simply stopped because the ship's power finally gave out and there was nothing left to send it with. I have spent my whole life wondering what that hour actually felt like for her, whether it felt like giving up, or whether it felt like something else, something closer to a decision, a choice to stop asking a universe that had already answered in its silence everything it intended to say. I don't know which it was, High Curator. I will never know because she died in the crossing that followed, and the only record of that hour that survives is a signal log with a timestamp and nothing else. I think that's part of why I'm here now. Because somewhere out there, right now, there might be another engineer, another mother, transmitting into a silence she believes is total. And I would rather spend every hour I have helping to make certain that silence ends before it reaches its own 18th hour, than spend those same hours safely at home, wondering afterward whether I could have done something and chose comfort instead. Vorn had not answered immediately, and when she finally spoke, it was not to offer comfort because she understood, watching the woman beside her, that comfort was not what the moment required. "I want you to know," she said instead, "that I think about that same 18th hour more often than I have told anyone, including my own counsel. I did not live through it. I will never fully understand its weight the way you do. But I carry it into every decision my office makes now, deliberately, because I decided a long time ago that an institution which forgets the exact, specific cost of its own failures is an institution destined to repeat them in some new, unrecognized form. I do not know if that makes me a good leader, Administrator Alvarenga. I know that it makes me a considerably more careful one than the administrators who came before me, and I intend to make certain that carefulness outlasts my own tenure in this office, however long that tenure eventually proves to be." It was in the retelling of that conversation, delivered before the full council in the closing minutes of her address, that Vorn finally arrived at the detail she considered most consequential of the entire 8-month crisis. She told me that her grandmother had spent the final hours of her transmission believing, with what records survive suggest was a settling, exhausted certainty, that no one was listening, that the silence on the other end of her call was total and permanent, and would remain that way regardless of how long she kept transmitting into it. She told me she came herself because she wanted this assembly to understand, not through a formal report, but through the plain fact of her presence, standing in the middle of your own evacuation effort, that the silence her grandmother once believed was permanent had, in fact, eventually been answered, just 47 years, and 206 lives, later than it should have been. I do not believe there is a version of today's proceedings that adequately settles that debt, honored colleagues. I do not believe debts of that particular shape are ever fully settled. I believe instead that they are honored continuously through every subsequent decision a government makes about whose distress calls it answers, and whose it allows itself to quietly, procedurally decline. We failed that test once, 47 years ago, in a decision made by a tired man following a doctrine none of us had yet found the courage to question. I would like this council to understand that we have now been given, through considerable grace we did not entirely earn, a second test, and that the humans who answered our call within 11 hours of receiving it did not do so because they had forgotten what our silence once cost them. They did so because they decided, individually and collectively, long before our crisis ever reached their desk, that they would rather be the kind of people capable of answering a distress call honestly than the kind of people who required a debt to be repaid before they would consider it worth their trouble. There remained, throughout the years of reform and crisis that followed the file's disclosure, one thread Nerys Calethorn had never fully resolved to her own satisfaction, and she returned to it, finally, in the quiet months after the evacuation crisis concluded, when the accumulated weight of everything she had helped set in motion finally afforded her the space to ask a question she had carried, unanswered, since the very first morning she opened the Horizon's Reach file. Velko Ossarin, the tired administrator whose single procedural decision had set the entire chain of tragedy and reform in motion, had retired from the contact threshold office 2 years after signing the observation-only recommendation, and the personnel record Nerys eventually located, buried in an entirely different division's archive, indicated that he had lived, afterward, an unremarkable private life on a modest agricultural world at the edge of correlate space, dying 11 years before Nerys ever opened his file, apparently without ever learning what his single tired signature had ultimately cost, or what it would eventually come to mean. She traveled to that world herself, in the end, a journey she took no formal justification for beyond her own private need to understand something the official record could never fully answer. And she found, in a small administrative archive maintained by the world's local historical society, a handful of letters Ossarin had written in his final years, addressed to no one in particular, the kind of private reflections a careful, methodical man sometimes commits to paper when he senses, without quite admitting it to himself, that his own conscience has unfinished business it has not yet found the courage to examine directly. I signed 42 recommendations that day, one letter read, dated some 3 years before his death, and I remember even now that I could not tell you the details of 41 of them if my life depended on it. I remember the 42nd because something about it troubled my sleep for several nights afterward, though I could not, at the time, have told you precisely why. I followed the doctrine exactly as it was written. I want that understood, whatever anyone eventually makes of this. But I have come to wonder, in the quiet years since my retirement, whether following a doctrine exactly as it is written is always the same thing as doing the right thing, or whether there are decisions where a careful man ought to have trusted the discomfort in his own chest over the certainty of the procedure in front of him. Neris read that letter a dozen times before she finally understood what she had been searching for when she made the journey. She had wanted, she realized, some version of villainy she could hold responsible, some clean and simple wrongdoing that would make the whole terrible chain of events easier to carry. What she found instead was a man who had, in his own quiet, private way, already begun the reckoning the rest of the assembly would not formally undertake for another 4 decades. A man who had died without ever knowing that his own unspoken doubt had been, in the end, entirely correct, and who had never received the chance to see what genuine accountability, finally and properly extended, might have looked like. She included his letters, with the local historical society's permission, in the Assembly's official record of the reform that followed the Horizons Reach disclosure, not as an excuse for what his decision had cost, but as a reminder. She wrote in the accompanying commentary that doctrines fail people long before individuals do, and that the truest measure of an institution's health is not whether it produces administrators incapable of tragic misjudgment, but whether it builds a framework careful enough that a single tired man's 40-second signal of the day is never again permitted to carry the full, unaided weight of 812 lives. Neris Calethorn, sitting in the chamber's records gallery during that address, thought of the small archive alcove where she had first opened the Horizons Reach file 19 years into a career she had, until that unremarkable morning, believed would never require her to make a decision that genuinely mattered. And she thought of the particular, terrible clarity of a young woman's voice asking, into a silence that would not answer her for 18 hours, and in the deepest sense, 43 years, whether anyone, anywhere, might simply confirm that she was not alone. She thought about the specific, hard-earned distance between the doctrine that had once made silence the safest, most procedurally correct response available to a frightened institution, and the reformed doctrine that now bore her own quiet, unglamorous fingerprints somewhere in its long chain of authorship. And she understood, watching Vorn's address conclude to a chamber that rose, almost as one body, in an expression of formal acknowledgement the correlate assembly reserved, for its most consequential moments, that the true measure of what had changed was never going to be found in any single ceremony, any single treaty, any single evacuation fleet arriving within 11 hours of a desperate call. It was going to be found, instead, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions made afterward, by administrators considerably less tired, considerably less willing to let a difficult signal pass quietly into an observation-only file, because somewhere in the Assembly's collective memory now lived the specific, unforgettable fact of 812 people transmitting honestly into the dark, and 206 of them paying, with everything they had left to give, for a doctrine that had once decided their voices did not yet meet the threshold required to be heard. Ambassador Adami visited the correlate assembly one final time before her own retirement from active diplomatic service, some years after the evacuation crisis had concluded, and the reformed doctrine had settled into the unremarkable, functioning ordinariness that every successful reform eventually earns for itself. And she requested, on that final visit, a single meeting that appeared on no official itinerary and drew no formal notice from either government's press offices. She met Vorn in a small courtyard adjacent to the council chamber, the same courtyard where the two of them had once spent 11 difficult days arguing over the precise scope of an oversight body's authority. And they sat together for the better part of an hour without either of them raising a single point of formal business. "I want to ask you something before I leave this post for the last time," Adami said finally. "Something I don't believe either of us has said plainly to the other, across everything we've built together since that first terrible file arrived on my desk. Do you believe your assembly would have found its way to this same reform eventually, without the crisis that forced it? Without my government's response to your evacuation appeal proving, in the most concrete terms available, exactly what genuine partnership could look like?" Vorn considered the question for a long time before she answered, her attention on the same slow water beyond the courtyard that had witnessed so much of their difficult, consequential history together. "I have asked myself that question more times than I would like to admit, Ambassador," she said finally. "I would like to believe that an institution capable of genuine moral reckoning does not require a crisis to complete the reckoning it has already begun. I am not certain I believe that, honestly, not after 4 centuries of watching how slowly institutions like mine tend to change, even when the moral case for change is already, on paper, entirely settled. I think the crisis mattered. I think it mattered enormously, not because it taught us anything we did not already, in principle, understand, but because it gave an entire generation of correlate citizens something considerably more persuasive than a treaty clause to carry forward. The plain, undeniable memory of watching your engineers stand beside ours in the middle of a disaster, asking for nothing in return beyond the simple fact of having helped. I do not know if the reform would have held in the long term without that memory anchoring it. I am grateful, in a way I find difficult to fully articulate, that we were never forced to find out. My government did not send that fleet to anchor your reform, High Curator," Adami said. "I want you to understand that clearly before I leave this post. We sent it because your people needed help, and we had decided, long before your crisis ever reached our desk, exactly what kind of ally we intended to be when that day arrived. Whatever it did for your own internal politics was never the calculation. It was simply the truth, delivered honestly, the same way it would have been delivered to any ally who asked us for help in an hour like that one." "I know," Vorn said. "I think that is precisely why it mattered as much as it did." They sat together in the courtyard a while longer, two leaders who had spent the better part of a difficult decade building something neither of their governments had ever previously attempted with a species so different from their own in history, in temperament, in the particular shape of the wounds each carried into the partnership. And when Adami finally rose to leave, she carried with her a small data crystal that Vorn had prepared for the occasion, containing, she explained, the full and complete record of Velko Ossarin's recovered letters, formally released for the first time beyond the Assembly's own archives, along with a single handwritten note in Vorn's own careful script. For Hollow Landing, and for everyone who ever transmitted into a silence they feared would never be answered. We heard you in the end. We are sorry it took us so long. No. Eris Kalethorn learned of that final exchange only years later, in a brief mention within Adami's own memoirs, published after her retirement, and she found herself, reading it, returning once more to the small archive alcove where the entire long, difficult chain of consequence had first begun, on an unremarkable morning 19 years into a career she had believed, until that day, would never require anything more consequential of her than careful cataloging and quiet, unremarked diligence. She had not known, opening that file, that she was about to spend the better part of a decade of her professional life, untangling the full weight of what a single tired signature had cost, nor that the untangling would eventually reshape her assembly's most fundamental doctrine, nor that it would, in the end, forge a partnership tested and proven not through ceremony, but through the plain, unglamorous work of showing up when it mattered most. She thought, finally, of Hollow Landing itself, a settlement built from the wreckage of a ship never designed to be permanently grounded, named deliberately to ensure that no one who lived there would ever forget the particular hollow silence that founded it. And she thought that perhaps the truest legacy of that terrible, unanswered signal was not the treaty it eventually produced, nor the reformed doctrine, nor even the 40 million lives saved 4 years later by a fleet that arrived because a granddaughter had decided, long before her own crisis ever came, exactly what kind of answer she owed to a universe that had once failed to give her family one. It was the settlement itself, still standing, still stubbornly, deliberately self-sufficient, a permanent monument built not to grievance, but to the specific, hard human conviction that even the deepest silence could eventually be answered, if enough people, on enough desperate frequencies, across enough painful years, refused to stop insisting that someone, somewhere, was listening after all. And it was something smaller still, Nerys thought, something she had come to understand only slowly, across the accumulated years of her own long involvement in the story, the particular, specific quality of a species that had every reason, after 43 years and 206 lives, to answer a desperate call for help with something considerably less generous than an evacuation fleet arriving within 11 hours. Earth had not withheld its answer to extract an apology first, had not measured its assistance against the size of the debt still technically outstanding, had not required Vorn's counsel to earn forgiveness before earning help. It had simply decided, individually and collectively, in 10,000 small conversations across kitchen tables and settlement councils, and government offices no different in their essential ordinariness from the one where Elena Alvarengacho had once stood, and asked her own government not to walk away from the negotiating table, that the measure of who they intended to be would never depend on what anyone else had once failed to be for them. That was the thread running, unbroken, from a 9-year-old boy's death in a failing compartment to 198,000 correlate lives saved 4 decades later, and Nerys Calethorn, closing the final record of a case that had defined the better part of her career, understood that it was very likely the truest thing her long investigation had ever managed to prove.